I never thought the person I trusted most would turn my own son against me. That's how it started, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look sicker than they were in a debrief room at Naval Station Norfolk, where I'd sat 100 times as the one asking hard questions. This time I was the one in the chair, and the word my 17-year-old son spit at me, traitor, landed like a rifle round in a chapel. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. Daniel didn't whisper it. He said it with the conviction of a boy who thought he was finally brave, finally seeing through his old man. He squared his shoulders, jaw working, eyes rimmed red like he'd argued himself hoarse into believing it. Behind him, my ex-wife, Claire, leaned against the wall with her arms folded and that little smirk she puts on when she knows she's winning. The same smirk she used at mediation when she said, "I'm not angry, Mark, I'm just disappointed," and then demanded the house. A commander I sit deployed with slid a folder across the table. "Mark," he said, not meeting my eyes, "walk us through this." On the tab, Travers, Mark, suspected breach. Inside, a highlight splashed printout of a wire transfer, $699,842, purporting to move from an account linked to me through a shell outfit I'd never heard of. There was a grainy PDF of a signature that looked like mine if you only knew me on paper. Paper lies easier than people. There was also a restaurant slip. La Bistro, the polished French place on Granby, $2,800, 3 bottles of Bordeaux I couldn't pronounce, 2 prefix tastings I never ate, and my initials scrawled in black. It was the kind of arrogant bill people rack up when they're spending someone else's money. There are tells on a check, strokes, pressure, where the ink pools when you're tired. This was close, sloppy close. Claire stepped forward, perfume like cold flowers. "You always preached integrity," she said softly. "For the room, not for me. If you want to understand Claire, you have to understand that resentment is a kind of gravity. When we were married, she told our friends I was born under a lucky star. She'd say it like a joke, then stare too long to make sure I heard the truth inside it. I made rank. I came home with letters from commanders. The garage I bought on 27th Street turned into a paying restoration shop. The little place I always said would be my pension if the government ever forgot my name. When my last duty assignment ended and I chose wrenches over contracts, she called it downgrading. What she meant was I'd stop being the man she could brag about at fundraisers. She never wanted second place, and she hated that my name still carried a first-place kind of respect in every room I walked into. The billables at the bistro were a message. The wire transfer was a bullet with my name scratched in it. The aim was my record, but the target was older. The deed on my shop, the equity in my house, the credibility that made judges listen when I spoke, and most of all, the boy who still called me Dad when he forgot to be angry. "Dad," Daniel said, voice low, "how could you?" 3 words. I've heard uglier things in uglier rooms, but nothing that hollow. He'd been fading from me for months, and I hadn't named it. It started at the end of summer, August, when the heat in Norfolk hangs on you like a wet coat. He began to cancel our Sunday shop time to study at Mom's. He stopped texting me about the '68 Mustang's carburetor and sent one-word replies instead. I told myself it was senior year stress, the wobble before launch. I didn't see the way she tilted the whole field. I kept my voice steady. "I didn't do this." He flinched like he wanted to believe me and had promised someone he wouldn't. Across the table, an investigator tapped a page with a capped pen. The wire corresponds to a procurement window you had visibility into last spring. That sips the allegation. Visibility is not access. Access is not action. Action is not me. Still, I watched my badge, my clearance, my history, slide across the table and into a brown envelope. Paper is easy to carry away. Reputations require both hands. "I need to read every line," I said. They let me, half because we'd bled together once upon a time, half because it looks good to let a man watch his own funeral. I located the merchant auth code on the Le Bistro slip, and the routing URL on the wire docs. I noted the timestamp, October 31st, 9:12 p.m. I was not at a French restaurant that night. I was on I-64 West, pumping $28.07 of regular unleaded into my truck at a Cumberland Farms off exit 205. The receipt, crumpled and underlined, sat folded in the right-hand slot of my wallet, habit born of a life spent proving where I'd been. Claire watched me clock the details. Her smile said, "Go ahead, gladiator, swing at smoke." "You could make this easy," she said softly. "Just for me this time. Resign. Transfer the titles. Save what's left of your dignity." Titles. The house we'd bought when Daniel was 8, the one with the oak tree he used to climb, and the workshop garage I refinished by hand. On paper, post-divorce. The split is math. In a life, it's a story. Every bolt I turned in that shop was a future I was building for us. Every receipt was my pension stamped in thermal ink. A commander I respected, still do, cleared his throat. "Your access is suspended pending review," he said, voice military flat. "Cooperate, Mark." I nodded because rage is a kind of rope, and if you grab it with both hands in a room like that, you get dragged. I signed the acknowledgement with a pen that shook once and stopped. I stood. I watched Daniel avoid my eyes. He brushed past me and his shoulder, a shoulder I used to carry on my back when he was too tired to walk from the pier to the parking lot, hit mine hard enough to make the papers in my hands stutter. The November air slapped me when I stepped outside. The river wind off the Elizabeth cut through my coat. I could taste salt and old iron. I walked to my truck like a man crossing a private desert, sat behind the wheel and laid the folder on the passenger seat. The workshop key hung heavy on my ring, the brass worn down by a decade of honest use. I turned it in my fingers and thought about how many nights that place had made sense of the day. When marriage counseling failed, the therapist asked Claire what she wanted that she didn't have. She laughed and said, "Control." I filed that line away and pretended it wasn't a threat. That was my first mistake. I drove to the shop on 27th Street with the radio off, the heater coughing. Inside, it smelled like old leather and warm oil. The '68 Mustang sat under a tarp like a sleeping animal. I lifted the edge and ran my hand along the fender. When Daniel was 12, we'd chalked a line on this very concrete and raced lug nuts across it. When he was 14, he could find a vacuum leak by ear. When he was 16, he told me he wanted to build something that would outlast him. "Start with the truth," I'd said, because I'm corny like that when I'm proud. I wondered what she'd said in place of that truth, and how often. I laid the folder open on my workbench beside the carburetor rebuild kit and a note I'd written to myself on a post-it called Jordan Title Search. Jordan Hayes, old Intel buddy turned PI, owed me a favor and kept receipts like a dragon keeps coins. I didn't dial, not yet. First rule, breathe, then document. I took out my wallet, flattened the Cumberland Farms $28.07, slip on the bench, and circled the 10:30 first date with a grease pencil. I wrote 9:12 p.m. beside it from memory. Then I wrote Le Bistro 10:30 firsts, 9:12 p.m. on the yellow pad, and drew a line between them. I photographed both with the old Nikon I keep for build updates, because a phone can be subpoenaed and a camera card is a thing that sits quietly in a drawer until you show it the light. I opened my shop safe. 3 turns right, 2 left, 1 right, and slid the photos into a manila folder labeled Shop Deed Insurance. I changed the label to Shop Deed Insurance Evidence, because sometimes renaming a thing is the first step toward surviving it. I clicked the safe closed and turned the wheel until the tumblers sighed. The sound steadied me. There's a line between revenge and justice, and if you blur it, you become the thing you're trying to defeat. I've spent a career walking that line in deserts and cities with names I can't say into a microphone. Tonight I felt it under my boots again, narrow and cold. Claire thinks I'm a hammer, but I'm a level. I find where the truth tilts. I correct it, one shim at a time. I pulled the shop ledger, flipped to October, November, and penciled in the gas expense under truck ops. Every line item is a footprint. People who fake trails forget how many places the real ones leave impressions. Bank debits, cell tower pings, the bartender who remembers your jacket, the waitress who notes you prefer the corner table, the grease stain you carry home because you can't help wiping your hands on your jeans. I would find the places their story forgot to step. I stood in the doorway and listened to the quiet. Outside, a train horn bled through the night from the port. Inside, the clock above the tool chest ticked loud enough to count my heartbeat down from angry to useful. Tomorrow, I would call the bank's fraud unit and freeze anything with my forged name on it. I would request the merchant copy from Le Bistro with the EMV metadata that proves which physical card was dipped and where. I would text Jordan about corporate filings for Pike's company and a title search on the shell outfit tied to that $699,842. I would schedule time with Rebecca Mills, the only attorney who ever told me no and made me grateful for it, and hand her the folder after I'd added 3 more pages that didn't exist yet. But tonight, I made a different kind of promise. I took the Lebistro printout and the wire summary, set them on the bench, and placed the Cumberland Farms receipt between them like a wedge. I wrote a date at the top of a fresh page, November 2nd. Then I wrote a sentence I didn't say out loud. I'm not here to hurt you, Claire. I'm here to stop you. You don't lose a man like me. You give him away one cut at a time. You think you can buy the last cut with forged ink and a boy's broken faith. But ink dries and boys grow up, and faith, if you treat it right, turns back into trust. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and slid a new deadbolt I'd installed that afternoon, 3 inches of steel into a frame I'd reinforced myself. Outside, the wind off the river had gone colder. I pulled my coat tighter and looked up at a sliver of moon over 27th Street. Somewhere across town, Claire was telling our son a story about heroes and villains with our names in the wrong places. Tomorrow I would start fixing the names. Tonight I chose my first weapon. It wasn't rage. It wasn't a fist. It was a receipt with $28.07 printed in fading ink and a line I drew through a lie. You think the world is solid, but when it shatters, you realize you has been living in a house of glass. The morning after the debrief, I sat in my workshop staring at the '68 Mustang like it might blink and tell me what to do. I'd left the fluorescent hell of the base with my badge gone and my son's voice echoing in my chest. And I came here because the smell of oil and dust is the only thing that's ever steadied me. But that morning, even the familiar scents felt foreign, like I didn't belong in my own skin. I poured whiskey into a glass, set it on the bench, and never touched it. Just stared at the amber light refracting against the carburetor kit I'd abandoned mid-build. It felt like one more unfinished piece of my life. Everywhere I looked was a reminder of collapse, a framed certificate of commendation. Its corner curling, mocked me from the wall. A stack of unpaid invoices for restorations sat on the desk, numbers I should have chased last week but ignored. My phone buzzed twice. Rebecca Mills, my attorney friend, and I let it ring out. I wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. Instead, I pulled open the top drawer of my workbench and found the photograph. Daniel at age 9, his hair a mess, grease smeared across his cheeks, grinning as he held up a wrench too big for his hands. I used to joke that photo was proof he'd inherited my stubborn streak. Now it felt like evidence in a case I was losing. I sat there until the November light outside shifted from gray to darker gray, the kind of coastal gloom that makes clocks useless. My chest felt hollow. My hands shook without permission. Grief doesn't always arrive like tears. Sometimes it's a weight pressing your lungs until even air feels dishonest. That night, I drove home to the house I no longer called mine but still paid the mortgage on. Claire had decorated the porch for fall, burnt orange wreath, fake pumpkins, the whole curated suburban scene. Daniel's sneakers were on the mat. I wanted to knock, to demand he look me in the eye, but the thought of Claire opening the door behind him froze me. I sat in the truck with the engine off, watching the light in his bedroom flicker. A shadow moved across the blinds. He was in there, my son, breathing, existing, alive. And I was parked 20 feet away like a stranger stalking his own blood. Eventually I drove back to the shop. I couldn't stand the silence of my house. The air in that place was still heavy with Claire's absence. Her perfume in the curtains, her resentment soaked into the walls. So I slept on the cot in the corner of the workshop, wrapped in an army blanket, the Mustang under its tarp keeping me company like a witness. The next morning, November 4th, I woke to the sound of rain hammering the roof. Norfolk rain is relentless, like it wants to drown everything it touches. I brewed coffee in the old dented percolator, the kind that leaves grounds at the bottom, and opened my notebook. I forced myself to write, Clearance suspended. Daniel turned against me. Claire orchestrating documents. Receipts planted. Then underneath I wrote a single line in capital letters, prove her lies or lose him forever. My hand shook when I underlined it. That day, I tried to distract myself with work. A 72 Chevelle sat half-gutted in the bay. I sanded a panel for an hour, maybe two, until my arms burned, but the whole time, Claire's voice kept slipping in. You could make this easy. Resign. Transfer the titles. Save what's left of your dignity. Every scrape of the sander sounded like her laugh. Every bolt I tightened felt like a noose. By noon I collapsed back onto the stool, sweat mixing with sawdust, chest heaving. I wanted to smash something, glass, metal, anything to match the wreck inside me. Instead, I found myself holding the photograph of Daniel again. I whispered out loud to nobody. He seps all I sep got. The words shook me, because they were true. My pension, my clearance, my reputation, those things I could lose. But if I lost him, if Claire's poison stuck for good, then there would be nothing left of me worth saving. That night, Jordan Hayes stopped by the shop, unannounced. Old PI Navy buddy, eyes like someone who's seen too many secrets. He leaned against the doorway and just looked at me. You're not drinking, he said, nodding at the full glass of whiskey still untouched from the night before. Didn't see the point? I muttered. He stepped inside, boots squeaking on the wet floor. Don't sit, collapse, Mark. Not now. Not when she sips, betting on it. I wanted to tell him to leave, to let me sit in my ruin a little longer, but instead I nodded. Because he was right. Claire's whole strategy depended on me breaking apart. Jordan put a hand on my shoulder. Patience. Evidence first, anger later. After he left, I sat in the silence, chewing on his words. Patience, evidence, anger later. I wrote it in my notebook beneath my vow. For the first time since Daniel's accusation, I felt something shift, not hope, not yet, but resolve. I closed the notebook, slid it under the cot, and finally poured the whiskey down the drain. The storm outside roared on, but inside I began to feel the faintest rhythm of control returning. Because collapse is a stage, not a sentence. And if you survive it, if you sit in the ruins long enough, you start to see where the foundation still holds. And I had just enough left to build from. The pieces are all there. What matters is putting them together without losing yourself in the process. On Wednesday, November 5th, I unlocked the shop at 6:07 a.m., breath fogging in the Norfolk cold, and turned my workbench into a command post. The folder I'd relabeled Shop, Deed Insurance / Evidence sat center stage, flanked by a legal pad, my Nikon, and a cheap desk lamp that turned everything courtroom bright. I wrote a header on a fresh page, Operation, Level. Below it, 3 columns, Financials, Comms, Witnesses. I started with what I could control. At 6:21 a.m., I called Atlantic Harbor Credit Union and asked for the fraud unit. I gave my name, my suspended clearance ID, because truth is still truth, even when they've boxed it up, and requested a freeze and a written record of any accounts opened or modified with my SSN between October 1st and November 3rd. I asked specifically for any ACH requests tied to a shell entity named on the wire summary, G&P Logistics VA, a name I'd never seen until yesterday. The manager, a woman named T. Rios, logged my case and gave me a reference number I copied in thick block letters. AHCUFD 117369. I underlined it twice. At 6:48 a.m., I called the bistro and asked to speak to the general manager. I kept my tone polite, measured. This is Mark Travers. I need the merchant copy of a charge on October 31st, 9:12 p.m., Table 12. Total $2,800. I'm the alleged signer. I'm disputing the charge and need the EMV metadata, the chip read confirmation, card PAN last 4, and the POS terminal ID. The manager hesitated until I mentioned my attorney would be sending a letter of preservation that morning. He took my email and said he'd pull the batch. I wrote his name and the words batch 1030 one night close on my pad. At 7:02 a.m., I texted Jordan Hayes, need corporate filings for Gay and P Logistics VA plus last 2 years of UCC liens. Also, anything on Pike Dev Group, subsidiaries, DBAs, offshore ties, call when ready. He replied with a thumbs up and the words coffee in 20. I brewed it strong and black in the dented percolator, and by 7:26 a.m., Jordan walked in with rain on his jacket and a folder already fat with county clerk printouts. He didn't waste words. He spread documents on my bench like a dealer laying down a hand he knew would beat you. E&P Logistics is a shelf company, he said, tapping a filing date. May 15, 2 years ago, and a registered agent address that turned out to be a mailbox store on Colley Avenue. No payroll filings. No business license in Norfolk. UCC search shows a lien filed by Pike Development Group last year for equipment financing. But the description's blank. That's a tell. It's a placeholder for moving money, not stuff. He slid me another paper. Pike Development Group refiled articles in June, added a new managing member, C. Travers. The name punched breath out of me. Claire. Jordan nodded. On paper, she's advisory services. Bank records would show more, but we'll need Rebecca to subpoena. Meanwhile, I pulled their SAM.gov vendor registrations. PDG bid on a mid-year procurement for communications shelters. Code JX14, coincidentally the same window you had visibility into. G&P shows as a last-mile sub. It's cosmetic, they used the shell to look compliant. I wrote JX14 in my notebook, and beside it, visibility or access. Pike had learned that line from me years ago. I'd mentored him when he was still scrappy and honest enough to be worth my time. I'd taught him the difference between what you can see and what you can touch, and he'd spent the last few years turning that into a business model for theft. That betrayal had a different taste in my mouth. Metal and old blood. Phones? I asked. Jordan grinned like a coyote finding a weak fence. Glad you asked. He pulled a Walmart receipt from his folder, $39.99 prepaid Alcatel cash purchase, October 12th, plus two $20 refill cards. The cashier's initials were scrawled at the bottom. KM, store camera faces the prepaid rack. We'll need a letter from Rebecca to get the footage. I also ran a CNAM lookup on the outbound number listed in the procurement email metadata you kept. He tapped my printout from Act 1. It's a VoIP relay that bounces through Richmond. But the prepaid calls pinged a tower off Ghent at the same hours. Claire's Lexus telematics show movement. I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. Public recall notice on that model a while back included telematics access for owners who signed up. Claire Sepp's page is cached. People overshare when they think their lives are curated art. I took a slow breath. Evidence in 3 columns. The world starts to steady when ink hits paper and the lines connect. At 8:12 a.m., I called Rebecca Mills. She picked up on the first ring, voice clean and caffeinated. Tell me you haven't burned anything down yet, Mark. Not even a match, I said. But I need preservation letters out in the next 2 hours to Le Bistro, Atlantic Harbor, Walmart on Military Highway, Pike Dev Group, and G&P Logistics. And I want a spoliation notice to Pike Sips Council. Claire Sips now listed as a managing member on PDG. Rebecca exhaled the sound of a woman making room in a day already full. Email me everything you have, including case number AHCUFD117369. I'll draft Rule 45 subpoenas once we file. For now, preservation notices and a bar complaint draft in a sealed folder in case his attorney plays dirtier than normal. I told her about the $699,842 wire and the October 31st the bistro charge, and she cut in, "We'll also request the interchange logs from their acquirer chip transaction equals unique TVR star strings. Whoever cloned your identity didn't clone your card. If they used a physical card, we'll get the last 4. If they keyed it, we get the AVS mismatch. Either way, it won't be your numbers." I smiled despite myself. "I miss working with you. Flattery will get you a receipt," she deadpanned. "And a court date." By 9:03 a.m., my inbox pinged with Rebecca's draft letters. I printed them, signed where needed, scanned to PDF, and filed the originals in the safe, slotting them behind evidence. I added a fresh label, Evidence calms and slid in Jordan's prepaid phone receipts. Continuity isn't a suggestion. It's the only way to make a story undeniable. Through the morning, I cataloged every contact. I logged times down to the minute, not because a judge demanded it yet, but because good habits turn into admissible records when it counts. At 11:37 a.m., I stepped outside, dialed Daniel, and hung up at the first ring. I wanted to hear his voicemail, to remember the way he used to say his name, but even that felt like trespass. I wrote 11:37, didn't call, and underlined it twice. Boundaries are part of survival. That afternoon, Thursday, November 6th, Jordan and I drove to Walmart, store hash 1785, military HWY. I carried Rebecca's letter like a badge. The manager, Mrs. Patel, read it twice, then walked us to a back office where a monitor replayed October 12th, 7:43 p.m. We watched a woman with a dark coat and a scarf pulled tight approach. The prepaid rack, the angle was bad. Her face was tilted away, but the way she held her shoulders, the set of someone who thinks cameras are for other people, felt familiar. She grabbed the Alcatel and 2 refill cards, paid cash, and left. The clerk, KM, initialed the receipt in front of us when we asked if those were her initials. We made copies. Mrs. Patel signed a chain of custody note Jordan had pre-printed. On Friday, November 7th, the Le Bistro manager emailed the batch. He included a blurry photo of the merchant copy. The signature was a child's imitation of mine. The last 4 of the card on file were 3127. Mine end in 9013. I printed the email, the image, and the batch report, highlighted 3127, and wrote in the margin, "Not my card." The POS terminal ID showed LB2, corner of the bar, not the back dining room where I always sat with my back to a wall. Details betray liars. At 2:18 p.m., my bank fraud manager T. Rios called back. We flagged 2 inquiries tied to your SSN through a third-party aggregator on October 28th. The IP traces to a co-working hub off Bush Street. No new accounts opened, but a change of address attempt hit and failed. Address to where? I asked. 145 W. Willow, Suite 300, she said. Jordan mouthed, PDG office. I wrote it down, circled it, and felt the first clean bolt of satisfaction I'd had in days. All afternoon I let the documents tell me how to proceed. I drafted a timeline: October 12th prepaid phone, October 28th address attempt, October 31st Lee Bistro charge, November 2nd debrief. In the witnesses column I added KM Walmart clerk and left space for Lee Bistro bartender. People remember faces. Bartenders remember hands. I wanted someone to say, "He signed left-handed because I sign with my right." I kept Daniel out of my calls, but I didn't keep him out of my mind. When the shop quieted at dusk, I texted him. Tune-up kit came. You were right about the jets. Proud of you. No argument, no defense, just a line to a boy who used to care about air-fuel ratios like they were scripture. The message showed delivered, then sat there, blue and silent. I didn't send another. As the light died on November 7th, I set the week's haul on the bench. Prepaid phone receipt, Le Bistro batch, bank log, corporate filings. The photo of Daniel at 9, and I saw a path forming, not a miracle, not even a shortcut. A path. Rebecca would file the preservation letters formally Monday. Jordan would start knocking on doors. Ghent Tower logs, Willow Street co-working security. Pike's second in command, who always looked like a man 2 bad days from the truth. I locked the safe, turned the wheel, and rested my forehead against the cold metal for a breath. The courtroom wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was a destination with a date I could feel approaching like a train through the rails. I pictured a table, a judge. A stack of paper, not loud, not angry, just true. I whispered to the empty shop. "You wanted a fight of stories, Claire." I brought receipts. Outside, the Friday traffic on 27th Street hissed in the drizzle. Inside, I turned the Mustang's key to accessory and let the dash lights glow on the bench. Soft, amber, steady. Evidence doesn't love you back, but it will hold you up if you build it right. Saturday would be for money trails. Sunday for signatures, and Monday for court papers. I flipped the legal pad to a clean page and wrote next, methodical revenge, I follow the money. I struck where they thought I was weakest. The first real evidence came in pieces. Pieces they never thought anyone would find. On November 8th, I walked into the back office of First Virginia Bank and slid my ID across the counter. The branch manager, an older man named Harris, squinted at the government-issued badge but didn't ask questions. He was a lifer, one of those men who'd seen everything but never bothered to care about the paperwork unless someone told him to. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I'm here to verify a transaction, I said, sliding the printout of $2,800, the Le Bistro charge that Claire had inserted into the trail. The bank clerk called up the details on his screen and immediately frowned, tapping keys like he was making the numbers fit a formula. They didn't belong in. Not our transaction, Harris said finally, glancing at the printout. But I still need authorization to release account details from that merchant TIS processor. I pulled a letter I had Rebecca draft from my coat pocket and slid it over the counter. It was worded tightly, one of those pieces of paper you don't question because you know the recipient won't risk it. I smiled as Harris looked it over and nodded. Give me an hour, he said. But if this checks out, you still get your proof. I made a note in my pad, then left without a word. The thing about banking is when you follow the right paper trails, you find the people who don't think they're in the game anymore. People who think you've forgotten their part. It's those people who will slip up. On November 9th, I returned to the shop and logged everything from Harris's encounter. The Le Bistro bill, the $2,800 charge, and the fact that Harris had given me a solid lead. I took a deep breath and turned my attention to Graham Pike, the only man in the world who could unravel Claire's tightly wound strings. Jordan came by around noon. He'd run a background check on Pike. No surprise that Pike's name showed up attached to several shady dealings. I wasn't shocked. In the world of contractors, being dirty isn't just common, it's practically expected. But the real gold came when Jordan dug into Pike Development Group's legal filings. Found something interesting, Jordan said, throwing a manila folder on the bench. Pike wasn't set the first pick. The job was originally slated for Bridges Enterprises, but they pulled out after a conflict of interest notice was filed. Guess who signed it? I flipped through the pages of the folder until the signature caught my eye. Claire Travers. That was the real betrayal. Claire was neck-deep in this from the beginning. She'd pushed Pike onto the project under false pretenses, making sure she pulled every string, set every player in place. She'd made this personal, an act of revenge against me for things she could never truly let go of. Didn't Seth expect this much of a tie-in, Jordan muttered. Pike is a mess, but Claire, she Sep's playing a different game. She wants to bury you, Mark, to use your reputation against you until you Seth are gone. I closed the folder and stared at the contents for a while. Claire thought she could bankrupt me with her lies, but what she didn't realize was that revenge doesn't run on money. It runs on truth. By November 10th, I'd narrowed down the next steps. I needed Pike's offshore accounts. We had receipts, phone logs, and emails, each piece of the puzzle clicking into place. But offshore accounts? That was a different game entirely. I couldn't afford to let him slip into the shadows without drawing the truth out first. I spent the rest of the day drafting subpoenas, more official-looking than any I'd seen before, because I knew they would be served soon. Rebecca had already agreed to help me, and the plan was set in motion: freeze Pike's accounts, search his business contracts, and put the pressure on until he was forced into a corner. I checked my phone again. No response from Daniel, but I didn't expect one yet. The truth always gets out. Sometimes it just takes longer than you want. I could already feel the walls closing in around Claire's lies, her schemes crumbling like brittle paper. I closed up the shop that night, locking it tight and walking out into the cold. The air was sharp and clear, and for the first time in days I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace. Not yet. But a reminder: the truth never forgets. And neither did I. I was no longer just chasing evidence. I was building momentum. By November 11th, the groundwork was laid. Pike's offshore accounts had been identified, his shell companies mapped, and his legal shields analyzed. Every move he had made over the last 5 years, every signature, every false invoice, every concealed payment. I had it all. Rebecca called first thing in the morning, her voice sharp with anticipation. Mark Pikesip's Cayman accounts are now flagged. Our subpoenas are in motion. He won sips to see this coming. I leaned back in my chair, sipping lukewarm coffee. There was a sense of satisfaction in orchestrating chaos with precision. Every time I thought about Claire's smug face, the memory fueled my patience. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was a calculated storm. The same morning I visited the bistro. The manager remembered my previous visit and looked wary as I entered. I handed him another folder, this time containing evidence tying Pike's company to fraudulent invoices. He flipped through the documents, eyes widening as he realized the scope of the deception. "And so cooperate," he said finally. "You have all the records you need?" I nodded. Every transaction. Every hidden payment. The truth is coming out, whether they like it or not. By November 12th, Pike began to feel the pressure. Legal notices arrived at his corporate office, each one cutting deeper into his defenses. Emails were traced, contractors questioned, auditors mobilized. The once confident man was now scrambling, his empire teetering on the edge of collapse. I watched it all unfold silently. There's an artistry in revenge, the timing, the pacing, the precision. You don't strike too early. You don't show your hand too soon. You let them dance into the net they've built for themselves. Claire, however, remained the wild card. I knew she was panicking behind her polished veneer. Calls went unanswered, her assistants gave vague replies, and her usual social media bravado was conspicuously absent. It was exactly as it should be. On November 13th, I coordinated with Jordan to gather testimonies from employees Pike had intimidated. Each one painted a picture of manipulation, of greed, of lies stacked on lies. The narrative was clear. Pike was the instrument, Claire the mastermind. Late that night, I stood in the workshop, the hum of machinery surrounding me like a ritual drumbeat. I laid out the final pieces, the bistro invoices, validated offshore account subpoenas in motion, employee testimonies, documented Claire's own email trail, the ultimate proof of intent. Every piece was interconnected, every step methodical, every move irreversible. The beauty of this revenge was in its inevitability. When someone like Claire thinks she is untouchable, when she believes that power and wealth can shield her from consequences, the fall is far more satisfying, not because of her suffering, but because truth is unstoppable. On November 14th, I called Daniel. His voice was cautious but intrigued. "Mark," you said, pushing things far. "Are you sure?" "I've been sure," I said, my voice calm, deliberate. "This isn't sets about anger anymore. It's sets about closure. It's sets about justice. And it's sets coming, whether they see it or not." Hanging up, I looked around the workshop. The engine sat silent, the tools neatly aligned, and the night outside was cold but clear. I had started with a fractured heart, but now, with each calculated step, the storm I'd promised myself was beginning to take shape. No more hesitation. No more doubt. The path was clear. Claire's empire of lies was about to collapse, and I would be there to watch it unravel piece by piece, until justice had been served. Every day felt like standing on a razor sip's edge. By November 15th, the tension in the air had thickened. It was no longer just about gathering evidence. It was about watching everything I had meticulously built start to close in on Claire and Pike. The moment they realized the walls were collapsing, their desperation would make them slip. The key was waiting for them to make that fatal mistake. And I was ready. Jordan had tracked down the final piece of the puzzle, a private email thread between Claire and Pike, sent from one of their burner accounts. The contents of the exchange made my stomach churn, though it wasn't because of what they discussed, it was because of how calculated it all seemed. Claire, cold as stone, instructed Pike on how to frame me, how to use my reputation to cover their tracks, and how to erase any trace of the truth. It was chilling. "We've got them," Jordan said, that afternoon as he passed me the printout. "This email thread shows everything." She knew what she was doing, and Pike played right along. We set her one step away from calling in the final moves. I flipped through the pages, the weight of each word settling on my chest. Claire had used our son as a pawn, wrapped in her petty vendetta. Her thirst for control, her need to destroy me was deeper than I'd ever imagined. And Pike. He wasn't the naive, starry-eyed contractor I'd once mentored. He was a coward, afraid to stand on his own, hiding behind Claire's manipulations. On November 16th, the first wave of subpoenas hit Pike's corporate office. The tide was officially turning. His lawyer had no choice but to step in and try to mitigate the damage. That was the moment I knew they were scrambling. The facade was crumbling and they were scared. I could feel it in the way Claire's secretary started leaving more frantic voicemails, the way Pike's workers started looking over their shoulders. They knew we were coming, and they knew it was only a matter of time before their lies fell apart. The carefully constructed illusion of power, of safety, of wealth, they were all vanishing. That evening, I decided to press on one last front. The personal confrontation. I had avoided it until now. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed them to feel the heat of the legal fire before they realized they were cornered. But it was time to turn up the pressure. I called Claire, my heart steady, my voice cold as the night air. Yusuf made a lot of mistakes, Claire, and it's sups about time we talk about them. There was a long pause on the other end, a breath she couldn't hide. I don't know what you think you're still doing, Mark, but you're still playing with fire, she said, her voice laced with frustration. I still bury you in a courtroom if I have to. You once said get the chance, I replied, my tone calm, almost reassuring. Your moves are already exposed. I said done being your punching bag, and when this is over you still have no one left to manipulate. I hung up without another word, but something in the air shifted. I could hear her even from 1,000 miles away, scrambling. The reckoning was coming. The next day, November 17th, I met with Rebecca to go over the next steps. The legal documents were falling into place faster than I anticipated. The subpoena for Pike's offshore accounts had triggered an internal investigation at his company. The man who'd once been my protege was now facing the consequences of his actions, and Claire, she was falling apart. Rebecca looked over the documents and paused for a long moment. You know, Mark, you've been calm through this entire process, but something tells me that the real pressure is about to hit them. I nodded. It sets not about what I seth done, Rebecca. It sets about what they seth done. I not am just the one standing here to make sure they pay for it. On the morning of November 18th, the court filings went live. I had filed for an injunction to freeze both Claire's and Pike's assets until the full investigation was completed. It wasn't a long shot, but it was enough to force their hand. I walked into my workshop, the hum of machinery now more like background noise. I stood in front of the half-restored Mustang and ran my fingers over the smooth surface, remembering the days when it was just me and Daniel. No complications, no lies. But those days were gone. In their place was a man standing at the edge of the storm, and when it hit, when everything I had planned came to fruition, I would be standing tall in the aftermath. I could feel the shift now, the gears turning, the balance tipping in my favor. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the power of patience, the quiet kind of revenge that only comes with time, evidence, and precision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the endgame was clear. I would walk into that courtroom with my head high, and I would expose everything. Everything. The room was silent when the first receipt hit the table. It wasn't a normal courtroom. There were no dramatic gestures, no overblown speeches. Just me, Claire, Pike, and our lawyers. But the tension was suffocating, thick enough to feel on your skin. The air crackled with something far stronger than just a legal battle. It was a reckoning. The moment where all the lies, all the manipulations, would be laid bare. I walked into the courtroom early. I needed that time alone, time to think, time to remember why I'd fought so hard to get here. I could hear the hushed voices behind me, the murmurs of people waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Claire entered a few minutes later, her usual air of superiority in place, but there was a stiffness to her movements, like she knew the walls were closing in. I watched her, my heart beating steadily as I held back the impulse to look at Pike, who was sitting at the table beside her. The man I once considered a mentor. He was trying to look unbothered, but his eyes kept darting toward the door like he was searching for a way out. The judge walked in, his gavel striking once to call the session to order. His voice was calm, measured, a far cry from the emotions swirling inside me. He opened the floor for the first statements, and Claire's lawyer, a slick, confident man, stood up. I'd expected him to play dirty, but even I couldn't have anticipated how hard he would push. Your Honor, he began, looking at me with barely concealed contempt. Mark Travers is a man of many faces, military intelligence officer, veteran, and now it seems fraudster. The evidence is clear. His financial transactions are at the heart of this case. He has been hiding his actions under the guise of legitimate business dealings. And, most importantly, he has manipulated his own son into believing he was wronged. The words hit like a punch to the gut. My son, again the narrative Claire had set up, a lie wrapped in half-truths, all of it designed to tear my family apart, but I couldn't react. Not yet. I had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come. Rebecca, my attorney, stood next. Her voice was calm, but her words cut through the room like a sharpened blade. Your Honor, the accusations against my client are nothing more than fabrications. The supposed evidence of financial fraud, the supposed links to illegal activity, all of it is tied to one woman and one man, Claire Travers and Graham Pike. They have both manipulated and falsified documents in a desperate attempt to destroy Mr. Travers's reputation and his relationship with his son. Claire Sipp's lawyer scoffed. Objection, Your Honor. This is pure conjecture. There is no evidence of such claims. Rebecca remained unflinching. We will prove it. I have the documents right here. She pulled out the first piece of evidence, a receipt from the bistro dated October 31st, showing the fraudulent $2,800 charge. It had my name on it, at least on the surface. But it was clearly a forgery. I request to submit this into evidence, Rebecca said, placing the receipt in front of the judge. The silence in the room was oppressive. Every eye on the paper. The judge didn't flinch, but he nodded for it to be accepted. As the evidence was passed around, I caught a glimpse of Claire's face. Her smirk had faded, replaced by something like fear. She was realizing what I had already known: the truth was unstoppable. Next, Rebecca moved on to the bank transaction logs. The fraudulent $699,842 transfer, another of Claire's ploys. I had the evidence that showed it wasn't mine. It was a meticulously planned lie, crafted with an attention to detail that I could almost admire if it weren't designed to ruin me. Claire's lawyer was stumbling now. He had no response. The proof was too clear, too damning. I could see Pike shifting in his seat, his hand tapping nervously on the table. He was losing his cool. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting. He knew, just as I did, that this was the beginning of the end. The real kicker came when I stood up to present my own evidence. The judge called on me, and I walked to the front, my hands steady, my pulse still. I pulled out the email chain between Claire and Pike, the thread where they conspired to frame me, to manipulate the situation. This was the smoking gun, Claire's personal instructions sent directly to Pike. It laid everything bare. The betrayal, the scheming, the cold, calculated moves they had both made to destroy me. I sent like to submit this into evidence. I said, my voice calm but firm. This email proves everything. It says not just about money, it says about vengeance. Claire wanted to break me, and she used our son as a pawn to do it. Claire's face turned white. For the first time in this entire ordeal, she looked scared. I wasn't sure if it was the truth finally hitting her, or the way Pike was avoiding her gaze, but for once the power had shifted. I could feel it deep in my bones. The room was silent as the judge reviewed the emails. I caught sight of Claire's lawyer again. He looked less confident now, less sure of himself. His objections were weaker, his arguments crumbling. I stayed quiet, letting the silence speak louder than any words I could have said. The evidence was on the table now. There was no denying it. Finally, the judge looked up. Mr. Travers, you presented a solid case. We will take a brief recess before continuing. As the room began to empty, I stood still, absorbing what had just transpired. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the tide had fully turned in my favor. I looked at Claire one last time before she walked out of the courtroom. She didn't meet my eyes. She couldn't. The truth had found its way to the surface, and now she had no place left to hide. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was the culmination of everything I had been working toward, the reckoning. And in the silence of the courtroom, the truth had spoken louder than any lie Claire could have told. Justice has consequences even for the manipulative. The courtroom had cleared by the time we finished for the day. The last few whispers of conversation echoed through the halls, but the weight of what had just happened still hung in the air. Claire was gone, her lawyer trailing behind her, shaking his head. I didn't look at her. There was nothing left to say. I had finally shown her what happens when you push someone into a corner. But this wasn't a set the end. Not yet. The morning of December 19th, I woke up to a string of messages from Rebecca. The first one simply read, "The injunction is in place. Pike Sip's accounts are frozen. Claire Sips's assets are officially under investigation." I let the words settle in before I allowed myself a small exhale. That night I walked into the workshop, the space I'd fought so hard to protect. Everything felt different now, hollow, but in a way that made me feel more alive than I had in weeks. The Mustang's frame sat beneath the lights, still in pieces, but somehow more complete than it had been the day before. I walked toward it, touching the cold steel. Every piece of it was a reminder of what I had built, and what I was fighting for. Jordan called me later that afternoon. He had gotten word from his sources inside Pike's company. Things weren't looking good for him. It seemed his entire operation was about to be picked apart by the authorities. The fraud, the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, it was all coming to light. But it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the years of lies, the web they'd created, and the people they'd destroyed in their wake. "I can say it enough," Jordan said, his voice tinged with something like respect. "Pike Sip's done, but Claire Sip's no better. They Sip are both buried. This case is turning heads, Mark. Everyone Sip's watching." That felt like justice in its purest form. Every bit of their power slipping through their fingers, one mistake at a time. The fallout from this wasn't just financial. It was personal. It was about exposing everything they had hidden. Every shred of evidence, every shady deal. They were all coming to light, and nothing was going to stop it. But there was still one thing left to resolve: my son. Daniel had stopped answering my calls after the courtroom showdown, and as much as I hated it, I knew I couldn't rush him. The damage Claire had done wasn't something that could be undone overnight. I had to let him come to terms with the truth at his own pace. I had to prove to him that I was still the man he believed me to be. As I sat in the silence of the shop, the weight of everything we had been through settled in my chest. The price I had paid to get to this point wasn't just money. It was the shattered pieces of my family, and no amount of legal victories could change that. I could feel the emptiness where the bond between Daniel and I had once been, but there was hope. Hope that, in time, we would rebuild. On December 20th, I got another call from Rebecca. The investigation into Claire's financial dealings had escalated. The $699,842 wire transfer was traced back to her personal account, and authorities were now looking at her role in the conspiracy. The walls were closing in fast. I found myself pacing the workshop, the heavy weight of the truth sinking in. Claire had always been able to manipulate everything around her, but she'd underestimated me. She'd thought I was broken, lost in my own mistakes, when in reality I was just waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment had come. The legal fallout was far from over. Claire was facing charges that could cost her everything. Pike's company was being dismantled. But there was one thing I knew for certain: they had finally been exposed. All their lies, all their manipulation, everything they thought they could hide in the shadows was out in the open. And it wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for the truth. That night I sat down at my desk and pulled out the documents I had carefully gathered over the last few weeks. The lead bistro receipts, the bank transactions, the email exchanges between Claire and Pike. I stared at them for a long time, letting the reality of what had happened settle over me. They'd wanted to destroy me. They'd tried to break me, to ruin my reputation, to turn my own flesh and blood against me. But in the end, they'd been the ones to crumble. I reached for my phone, hesitant but determined. It was time to make one final call. The phone rang once, then twice. Finally, Daniel picked up. "Dad." His voice sounded hoarse, like he's been holding it back. "You don't have to say anything yet," I said, my voice low and steady. "Just listen. What you been told, the accusations, the lies, it was all part of a bigger game. I been fighting this battle for a long time, and now it's his time for you to hear the truth." There was a long pause, a silence that stretched across the line like a rope too thin to hold. Then finally Daniel spoke again. "I don't how to process all of this, Dad. I don't how to even look at you after everything. I know. I understand, but I sips him here. I always have been, and I will prove it to you, one day at a time. Just give me that chance." We both hung up without saying another word, but something had shifted, a small step, but a step forward nonetheless. As I stood there in the workshop, surrounded by the tools I had built my life on, I realized that the fight wasn't over yet, but the end was near. The truth was on my side, and that was something no one could take away from me. Claire and Pike had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated me, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders. The scales have finally balanced. The early morning sun cut through the blinds of my office like a knife, streaks of gold across the dark oak desk. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the bitter warmth settle my thoughts. Today was the day everything we had fought for would be solidified. Today the courtroom would deliver its final verdict. The tension in the city was palpable. Word had spread Claire and Pike's empire of deception was crumbling. The news outlets were already sniffing around, eager to paint the story with headlines about greed, betrayal, and revenge. But I didn't care about the headlines. This wasn't about recognition. This was about closure for my family, for myself, for every truth that had been buried beneath lies for years. Rebecca arrived, her presence a steady reminder that I wasn't set alone in this fight. She laid the final stack of evidence on the desk. Pike Sep's offshore account ledgers, Claire's forged contracts and falsified financial statements, testimonies from employees who had suffered in silence. "This is it," she said softly. "Everything they've done is documented. Today it all comes out." I nodded. My hand hovered over the folder, a sense of reverence washing over me. All the months of planning, the nights of restless strategizing, the careful gathering of proofs, it all boiled down to this moment. Justice wasn't just a word anymore. It was tangible, almost within reach. The courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and the air was thick with anticipation. Claire sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, lips pressed into a tight line. Pike's eyes darted nervously around the room, his bravado gone. I didn't need to look at them to know they understood. They had lost. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The gavel hit the wood with authority, echoing like a thunderclap through the hall. After reviewing the evidence, testimonies, and legal arguments presented, the judge began, voice steady. "This court finds the defendants, Claire Davenport and Pike Harwood, guilty of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud. Sentencing will follow immediately." Time seemed to stop. The weight of the words pressed against my chest, both suffocating and liberating. I felt a strange mixture of triumph and relief, a surge of emotions I hadn't realized had been bottled up for months. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every step I had taken had led to this. Pike slumped forward, muttering under his breath, the harsh reality finally sinking in. Claire's face drained of color, her eyes wide, unmasked for all to see. The web of lies they had spun for years was unraveling, thread by thread. Rebecca leaned over and whispered, "It's done. Justice is served." I allowed myself a small smile, one that felt foreign and heavy but honest. The courtroom erupted with murmurs, reporters scribbling frantically, cameras capturing every reaction. But I didn't look. My gaze drifted to the back row, to a figure I had been waiting to see, Daniel. He had come. Silent, cautious, uncertain, but present. And that was enough. His eyes met mine, a flicker of understanding and tentative trust shining through. No words were needed. This was the bridge I had been trying to rebuild for months. After the verdict, as the crowd dispersed, I found myself standing outside the courthouse, the cold December wind biting at my coat. Daniel approached, hesitant at first, then with a quiet confidence that mirrored my own. "Dad," he started, voice trembling but determined. I I think I understand now. You weren't just fighting for money or revenge. You were fighting for us." Joe reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Seth's always been fighting for you, Daniel, and I will continue to do so. But now it's Seth's your choice to trust me again. Take your time." The rest of the day passed in a blur. The media coverage was overwhelming, but I barely noticed. Pike and Claire were taken into custody, their empire dismantled piece by piece. The authorities praised the meticulous evidence, the strategy that had made this case airtight. It was a victory not just for me, but for every innocent person they had manipulated and betrayed. That evening I returned to the workshop, the place where it all began. The Mustang's frame gleamed under the dim overhead lights, almost like it knew it had survived the storm alongside me. I ran my hand along the polished metal, the tactile reality grounding me in a world that felt finally fair, finally just. Rebecca called one last time before leaving. "You did it, Mark. You took back everything that was yours, and more importantly, you reclaimed your life." "Not just mine," I said, looking around the workshop. "We reclaimed it. Daniel, you, me, we all did." For the first time in months, the heaviness in my chest lifted. The battle had been brutal, the scars permanent, but the victory undeniable. Justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a restoration. A promise kept, a lesson carved into the foundation of everything I held dear. As I locked up the workshop that night, the sky clear and cold above me, I realized something profound. Power, greed, and betrayal might shake the foundations of life, but truth and the courage to fight for it always prevails. And now, with Claire and Pike out of our lives, Daniel by my side, and the future wide open, I could finally breathe. The war was over. The lessons were learned. Justice at last had been served. The hardest battle isn't nailed against enemies. It steps against walls we build inside ourselves. The days after the trial were a strange kind of quiet. The courtroom buzz, the media frenzy, those were over. What was left now was the slow, almost painful work of rebuilding. Rebuilding my reputation, my peace of mind, and most importantly, my relationship with Daniel. I spent the night of December 22nd in the workshop, working on the Mustang. There was something cathartic about it. The sound of the tools, the familiar weight of the wrench in my hand. It reminded me of the days when Daniel and I would spend hours together, working on cars, talking about the future. But that future had been fractured by lies, the lies Claire had planted between us, the lies I had believed about myself. I had worked so hard to protect him, to shield him from the mess I had created in my own life. But in doing so, I had built walls, walls that kept him at arm's length. The worst part was knowing that, at some point, I had become the person I never wanted to be, distant, cold, absent. I checked my phone. There was a message from Daniel, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't a one-word reply or a passive acknowledgement. It was long, hesitant, but heartfelt. "Dad, I don't really know where to start. I guess I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I was angry and I let Mom's words shape the way I saw things. But I see it now. I understand why you did what you did. I don't know what to say. I think I want to talk more. About everything. Let's figure this out, one step at a time." The weight I had been carrying in my chest loosened. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic speech. Just a simple, honest admission. A bridge. I stood there for a moment, staring at the words before typing a response. "We still take it one step at a time. I step in here. Whenever you are stupper ready." I hit send and felt the release of breath that I didn't realize I had been holding. By the next morning, December 23rd, Daniel showed up at the workshop. He was quieter than usual, standing just inside the door, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his hoodie. The old nervous energy was there, but something else was too. Something tentative, something softer. A crack in the wall we had both built. I didn't know what to say. There were no rehearsed lines, no speeches I had prepared. Just the sound of tools on metal, the smell of oil, and the steady beat of our heartbeats. Dad, he started, his voice unsteady. Sorry for everything. I didn't understand. I let Mom's words cloud everything. I was mad, but I never thought about your side. About how hard you fought. I nodded, trying not to let the emotions surge too fast. The truth was, I didn't need him to say sorry. I didn't need him to apologize for being manipulated. What I needed was this moment. This small opening where we could speak again, as father and son. I know, I said, my voice steady, and I get it. I've been on the other side of this too, where all I wanted was for things to be different, and I didn't see how it would ever get better. But we suffer here now, and that sip's enough. Daniel didn't say anything for a while, just stood there, looking around the shop. Finally, he walked over to the Mustang. I could see the way his fingers brushed lightly against the fender, the way his gaze softened as he took in the project. He had always loved this car. It was his first love, more than any video game or toy. It had been a symbol of his future, something I had promised him we would finish together. But it was more than that now. It was a metaphor for our lives, broken, waiting to be rebuilt. Can we finish it together? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That simple question, like a key turning in a lock, opened everything up. I smiled. We spent the rest of the day in the shop, side by side, working in silence. The walls between us, built by resentment and manipulation, had finally begun to fall. The Mustang wasn't the only thing we were restoring. It was our relationship. That night, after we'd cleaned up, I sat down at the bench with Daniel. He had his phone out, scrolling through something, but he paused when he saw me watching him. I've been thinking, he said, eyes lifting to meet mine. I don't set know where this goes or what comes next. But I want to try, Dad. I don't set want to keep living in the past. You don't really have to have all the answers right now, I said. We'll figure it out, together. He nodded, and I could see something else in his eyes. Hope it wasn't an immediate fix. We weren't going to be able to just wipe away the months of pain, the betrayal, the lies, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that we were taking the first steps toward something real again. As I closed the door to the shop that night, I felt the weight of everything we had gone through, everything that had been lost, everything that had been regained. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in months, I felt like we had a chance. The road ahead would be difficult. It would take time, patience, and healing, but we were finally on the same path again, and that was worth every step. Redemption isn't flashy. It doesn't roar. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first rays of sun breaking through the winter fog. On December 23rd, Daniel and I continued working on the Mustang, but this time it wasn't just about the car. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen from us. Trust, understanding, and time lost. The garage smelled of oil, metal, and warm wood. Tools clinked softly as we moved around each other with a silent rhythm. He handed me a wrench without a word, and I felt the weight of what that simple gesture meant. It was trust, not blind, not naive, but trust that we could still build something together despite the cracks in our past. We talked too, slowly at first, about school, friends, and the mundane life, things that seemed trivial but had been impossible to discuss during the months of tension. I realized how much I had missed these moments. Not just him, but the simple rhythm of life with my son. The small victories of understanding each other. The shared laughter at nothing, the comfort of presence without expectation. Dad, Daniel said, after a while, his hands greasy from working on the engine. I don't think I ever really told you thank you for everything you did, even when I didn't see it. Even when I hated you for it. I paused, feeling a lump in my throat. You don't have to thank me, I said softly. I did what any father would do. I wanted to protect you. But you did more than that, he said. Eyes meeting mine. You never gave up. You fought for me even when it didn't feel like it. His words struck me deeper than any courtroom victory ever could. Redemption isn't about winning back what was lost in the eyes of others. It's about being recognized, truly seen by the person who matters most. And right now, that was Daniel. We worked through the evening, the Mustang slowly taking shape. Every polished surface, every tightened bolt, every clean line mirrored our effort to repair the unseen fractures in our lives. By nightfall, the car gleamed under the dim garage lights, a symbol of persistence, care, and second chances. Later, as we cleaned up, Daniel lingered. Can we start fresh? Not just with the car, but us. I nodded, a sense of peace settling over me. Yes, one step at a time. We selt take it slow, but we selt get there. He smiled, that rare, open smile that used to light up every room he entered. It was the smile I had been waiting for. The smile that signaled hope, forgiveness, and the possibility of a future untangled from the shadows of the past. That night, I sat alone in the workshop after he had gone to bed. I ran my hands over the Mustang's hood, feeling the smooth metal beneath my fingers. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a testament to resilience, to love that endures despite pain, lies, and betrayal. It reminded me that redemption isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about learning, repairing, and choosing to move forward with integrity. I took a deep breath and whispered into the quiet. We set are not defined by the past. We set are defined by how we rise from it. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I believed it. Redemption wasn't just in the courtroom victory. It wasn't in Claire's downfall or Pike's humiliation. It was here, in the garage, in the quiet moments with my son, in the shared laughter and the tentative trust we were rebuilding. By December 24th, we had finished the Mustang. It was more than a machine now, it was a mirror of us, polished, repaired, and ready for a new journey. And so were we. I looked at Daniel, leaning against the hood with a proud smile, and I knew this was our true victory, not revenge, not justice, redemption. Christmas morning broke with a quiet serenity, unusual after months of chaos. Snow lightly dusted the workshop roof, the world outside looking soft and untouchable. Daniel and I stepped outside. The Mustang parked proudly in the driveway, glinting under the pale winter sun. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of our journey of battles fought, lessons learned, and wounds slowly healing. Can we take it for a drive? Daniel asked, eyes wide with excitement. I chuckled. A rare, genuine laugh, the sound warm and unguarded. Of course, I said. Handing him the keys, I felt a surge of pride. This wasn't about control anymore. It was about trust, sharing life, and embracing freedom together. We drove through the silent streets, the engine's hum blending with the crunch of snow under tires. Daniel narrated stories from school, friends, and dreams he hadn't dared share before. I listened, really listened, without interruption, judgment, or impatience. The shift was palpable. It was as though months of tension had melted away, leaving a clean slate, a road stretching endlessly before us. Later we returned home, and I prepared a simple breakfast. Pancakes, syrup, and steaming cocoa, comfort food for a comforted soul. We sat side by side at the kitchen table, the warmth from the stove mingling with the warmth in my chest. For the first time I felt truly present, unburdened by revenge, guilt, or unresolved anger. The weight of the past was still there. Yes, but it no longer dictated the pace of our lives. Daniel suddenly reached across the table, taking my hand. Dad, I want us to promise something. His voice was serious now, tinged with that adolescent earnestness that cut through pretense. I nodded. Anything, son. We promise to always be honest, to talk, even when it sips hard, to not let the past hold us back, to build things, not break them. His words struck deep, not as a plea but as a covenant. I squeezed his hand, a silent agreement forming between us. Yes, Daniel, always. The rest of the day flowed gently. We cleared the garage together, organizing tools, polishing surfaces, and even hanging up a few lights for Christmas. Small acts, seemingly mundane, but charged with new meaning. Every shared glance, every laughter-filled moment, was a stitch repairing the torn fabric of our family. In the evening, Claire's defeat had already reached us through the usual channels, emails, whispers, and the occasional smug comment from people who had cheered our justice. But it felt insignificant now. We didn't need validation from the world. The victory that mattered was here, in this kitchen, in the garage, in the shared moments that stitched back the fragile tapestry of father and son. I watched Daniel fall asleep that night on the couch, a book clutched to his chest, exhaustion mingled with contentment on his face. For a long while I sat nearby, reflecting on the journey, every confrontation, every strategic move, every moment of despair, and every flicker of hope that kept us moving forward. Tomorrow the world would continue. Life would throw new challenges, as it always did. But I felt ready, stronger, calmer, guided not by vengeance, but by understanding, resilience, and love. The future wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. And as I closed the garage door for the night, listening to the gentle sighs of the Mustang resting under the dim light, I whispered softly, almost to myself, "This is just the beginning. We rise, we rebuild, we live." For the first time in a long time, the horizon wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The final days of December carried a quiet magic, one that had little to do with snow or holiday cheer, and everything to do with the peace we had fought so hard to reclaim. The workshop hummed with life again, not the frantic, tense energy of past months, but a calm, purposeful rhythm. Tools were sharpened, surfaces polished, and cars lined up like soldiers at attention, ready for a new chapter. I watched Daniel move among the garage aisles, his confidence growing. He knew the routines now, knew how to handle small tasks safely, and even offered insights on how to organize tools more efficiently. "Dad, if we set the shelves like this," he suggested, moving a crate slightly, "we can avoid bumping into each other and save time." His voice carried the ease of someone finally at home, someone whose world felt predictable, safe, and collaborative. I smiled, a mixture of pride and quiet relief. "You grown, Daniel, more than I realized." The days passed, each a gentle reinforcement of stability. We started small projects together, restoring a vintage car for a local exhibit, helping a neighbor with repairs, even redesigning parts of the workshop for better workflow. These acts, mundane on the surface, were monumental internally. Every task we completed side by side strengthened our bond, healing invisible fractures left by months of tension, fear, and the shadow of Claire's manipulation. On the 29th, I met with old allies, those who had quietly supported me, offering counsel and resources without asking for recognition. We discussed plans for the upcoming year, ways to expand the workshop, and how to teach apprentices not just mechanics, but responsibility, patience, and integrity. The past had taught me the value of mentorship, of guiding rather than dictating, of building futures instead of destroying enemies. That night, Daniel and I sat outside on the cold porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. The world seemed vast, yet intimate, as if every twinkling light whispered that growth, resilience, and connection mattered more than wealth, revenge, or power. "Dad," he said softly, "do you think everything we went through it was necessary?" I pondered the question, feeling the weight of truth and humility. Some of it, yes. Not because I wanted it, but because life teaches in its own harsh ways. But what matters now is what we do next, not what we endured. His small hand rested over mine, a gesture of trust and partnership. "Then let's make it count," he whispered. Christmas had passed, and the new year approached, but time felt less like a countdown and more like a continuum, a river we could navigate with intention and care. We planned family traditions anew, baking on weekends, fixing old cars together, even volunteering in local community projects. These acts, simple yet profound, became symbols of the legacy I wanted to leave, not one of revenge or domination, but of resilience, mentorship, and the quiet triumph of connection over conflict. On the 31st, as fireworks painted the sky in fleeting bursts of brilliance, Daniel and I stood side by side, watching the display. Our breaths formed clouds in the cold night air, yet warmth radiated from within. "Happy New Year, Dad," he said. "Happy New Year, son," I replied, my voice steady, unshaken by the shadows of the past. The workshop lights glimmered behind us, the cars rested in their bays, and the world felt expansive yet intimate. Every confrontation, every loss, every act of courage, and every moment of tenderness had led us here, not to perfection, but to presence, not to revenge, but to reconciliation. As the clock struck midnight, I silently vowed the lessons we learned, the bonds we rebuilt, and the strength we discovered would guide us forward. This wasn't merely survival, it was life reclaimed, a legacy nurtured, a future forged with intention and love. And in that quiet triumph, I finally understood justice had been served, but more importantly, life had been redeemed.